Chen Guangcheng, the Chinese human rights activist who escaped house arrest to shelter in the US Embassy in Beijing, has left American protection. So did the US buckle too easily under Chinese pressure? You're watching Inside Story from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. Chen Guangcheng has long been an irritant for Chinese authorities as he campaigns to expose the harsh realities behind the country's one-child policy. His activism landed him a 4-year jail term, and even after his release in 2010, he was put under de facto house arrest by local authorities. But last week, he escaped and sought protection at the US Embassy in Beijing. He remained there for 6 days as the State Department's legal advisor and the Assistant Secretary of State for Asian and Pacific Affairs negotiated with Chinese officials. Finally, he was escorted to a nearby hospital. But the circumstances of his departure are a matter of controversy. The Associated Press reported that US officials implied to Chen that his wife and children would not be safe if he did not leave the embassy. Not only that, but Chen disputes key elements of the account given by US officials of his release, including that he said he wanted to kiss Hillary Clinton upon his release. US officials deny they relayed any threats to Chen, but do acknowledge he was told he would lose the chance to be reunited with his family if he did not leave. The incident has overshadowed a trip to China by the US Secretary of State and other senior officials there in Beijing for talks on trade and foreign policy. China has demanded an apology from the US for what they've called interference in Chinese domestic affairs. A little earlier, I spoke to Bob Fu, president of China Aid, a dissidents' rights group who's been monitoring the situation closely. I asked him what Mr. Chen has actually said about the circumstances of his departure from the embassy.
According to what he said to at least 3 friends over the phone that I have been very close, that he received a very credible, substantial threat by the Chinese government representatives before he walked out of the US Embassy protection. Basically, he was told that if he didn't walk out of the US Embassy today, on May the 2nd, his wife and his children will be sent back to his hometown. I mean, he know what that meant. A number of mobs and are already waiting in his house and waiting to beat up his wife. So he has faced enormous pressure to make that choice, and knowing that his wife's life could be could be killed.
So it was the implication of what US officials told him that his family would return to his village that concerned him. The US officials didn't actually say his family would be attacked if he didn't leave the embassy.
Well, that's absolutely, I mean, to any people who knows the hellish life in that village and his house. What does it mean to force your wife and children back to your village? That's nothing but a hell. I think if anybody hear that and doesn't think it's a threat, I think that's unbelievable. And in any country, that constitute a 911 call.
So he didn't leave then of his own choice.
He felt pressured, and he has to make that choice, and he has no other choices. And although he said he wants to actually come to the U.S., and he was not seeking asylum, but he wants to come to the U.S. And I mean, you can make a distinction between coming or seeking asylum, per se.
But was there any commitment, though, that US officials would remain with Mr. Chen and his family and as these details were being worked out?
There's no commitment, and actually the family are now in the Chinese hospital alone without any US officials' presence at all.
But was any U.S. official, was there any U.S. presence pledged by U.S. officials in this period?
As far as I know, there's not any pledge. And I did, when I get the call from the Assistant Secretary Mike Posner this morning to brief me about the development, and he said he made an appointment to visit him tomorrow.
Given all of this, what do you make of it when Hillary Clinton says Chen's decision to leave the embassy reflected his choice and our values, U.S. values?
I'm wondering, given what has been happening and developing, that Chen absolutely knows that is a threat, and I don't think the U.S. Officials are naive on that. And I think basically from the minimum analysis, the U.S. wants Chen to be gone, and before the Secretary Clinton's meeting with the Chinese leaders to talk about what they call the more important issues. And I think that's unfortunate, and that's a shame.
So how has the US handled this controversy, and what role does a concern for human rights play in US foreign policy anyway? We're joined by Nancy Soderberg, a US diplomat with extensive experience, including a spell as a representative at the United Nations, Bill Blum, an historian and journalist who's a staunch critic of US foreign policy, and Lianchao Han, who is Vice President of Initiatives for China. Lianchao Han, then, when we spoke to you a few hours ago, it seemed that you were quite grateful for State Department and US support in this case, but does it seem so clear-cut now?
No, I think in the morning we were very pleased with the result, with the outcome of the negotiations. But later on, we found out that it wasn't the case. And what happened, as Bob Fu indicated, we also have some contact, some supporters outside the Chaoyang Hospital try to get in to visit Chen Guangcheng, but they were not able to do that. And the hospital was heavily guarded. And also, when they made the arrangement, they said the Chinese government will guarantee Chen Guangcheng's safety, and also he will live a normal life in China. But doesn't seem to be the case now, because we have Chen Guangcheng's phone number. We tried to call him, but there wasn't no answer. And I think his phone is either been taken away from him by the government, or somehow they blocked. That seems to be, there's no the decision made very hasty. And without any mechanism to verify how China is going to keep that promise.
All right, so as these reports are coming out, though, the mood certainly changed from the sort of briefings we were getting. The background briefings from US officials in China certainly were rather celebratory. They even said that Chen said that he talked to Hillary Clinton, said, "I want to kiss you." Now Chen said actually all he said was, "I want to see you immediately." As these new reports came out, the US State Department did issue a news statement responding to the AP report initially. It read in part, "At no time did any US officials speak to Chen about physical or legal threats to his wife and children, nor did Chinese officials make any such threats to us." US interlocutors did make clear that if Chen elected to stay in the embassy, Chinese officials had indicated to us that his family would be returned to Shandong and they would lose their opportunity to negotiate for reunification. Ambassador, clearly we don't really have that. There are a lot of details which we don't really know about, but how does this look as an experienced ambassador and foreign official for the US?
It looks very confusing. I don't think that we know exactly what's going on, so it's hard to judge exactly who's doing what. I think what's clear, though, is that Cheng saw the U.S. government rightly as a way to protect him and his family, went there seeking assistance, saw the United States, didn't go to the Russian embassy or another embassy. So I think the U.S. is trying to sort of deal with the changing situation from the Chinese.
This was suggesting he was wrong to think that.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think whatever happens, the U.S. is going to stand beside him and his family and make sure that we do everything in our power to make sure he is okay. Obviously, something changed from when he left the embassy to now. We don't know what that is. It's not the U.S. government that's changed its position. It was obviously misled or what, we don't know. But I think the United States stands as a beacon of freedom for the Chinese people, and that's the right thing. Secretary Clinton's committed to doing it. Mike Posner, our Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, will be seeing him tomorrow. I think we need to step back and say, what is causing this? What's causing this is the repressive situation of human rights in China.
Clearly there are some key meetings coming up, and wouldn't there have been an incentive to try and get this done as quickly as possible, certainly before those meetings began?
I think it's hard to rush to judgment when we don't know exactly what's happened. My guess is the United States will stand with him and protect him.
But at face value, though, if he now wants to leave the country and go to the U.S.,
he should have that right.
He would, and the U.S.
He
would
absolutely should have that right, and I can't imagine the U.S. government wouldn't welcome here and his family. The question is, if he comes here, he's going to want to come with his family. I think his preference, as he made it clear the last few days, was to stay there. That may have changed in the last 24 hours. I think the man's under an enormous amount of pressure. We've got to give him a little bit of time to figure this out. But in the meantime, his family must be safe. He must be safe, and give them time to decide their choice.
But if it does transpire, though, that he was basically let into Chinese custody without any guarantees of his safety or his family's safety, and that no one can reach him and so forth.
Well, obviously that's got to change. And with the Secretary of State there, I have no doubt that that will change.
Here's the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement that was released earlier. It read in part, "It must be pointed out that the United States Embassy took the Chinese citizen Chen Guangcheng into the embassy in an irregular manner, and China expresses its strong dissatisfaction over this. The U.S. handling of this was interference in Chinese domestic affairs, and this is totally unacceptable to China. The U.S. Embassy to China has a duty to abide by the relevant international and Chinese laws and should not engage in activities that are not in keeping with its functions. China demands the U.S. apologize over this, thoroughly investigate this incident, punish those who are responsible, and give assurances that such incidents will not recur." Bill Blum, in your experience then, does the U.S. want to avoid situations like this, or can it prove useful as Washington pushes its global strategic agenda?
I can think of two reasons why the White House would not be sorry that this has happened. One, we're in the midst of an election, of course, and this is a chance for Obama to look tough and act like a strong leader against a country which is regarded as one of the bad guys.
But currently, of course, the U.S. looks outwitted at this point. I mean, so presumably he has to now take a robust line then. If we
well, these things which have happened are so petty. Actually, I mean, it's very important to Chen and his family, of course, but in an international context, this is not exactly earth-shaking stuff. So I don't think that's going to affect the decision of the White House. They would welcome this as a chance for Obama to look tough on foreign policy. Also, we are in the midst of a Cold War. That term is not used yet, maybe, but it's a Cold War with China as much as it was with the Soviet Union. And China, of course, has to be pictured as the bad guy, as the Soviet Union was constantly. And this is a good example of the Chinese looking like the bad guy. In fact, they may very well be the bad guy in this case.
But that's interesting. Lianchao Han, I mean, at this point, these meetings are about to begin. The U.S. in some ways is asking for Chinese support on a lot of issues, from North Korea to Syria, on issues of trade and currency, and issues of currency, which actually seem to be sort of dying down, perhaps, in some ways. I mean, is this really a good time for the U.S., from Washington's point of view, to be getting into an argument like this over human rights?
No, not really. I think what they want to do is to get on their most important strategic economic dialogue rather than focus on Chen Guangcheng. So they made the decision so hastily and just threw Chen Guangcheng threw a ship to a pack of hungry wolves. I think it's a wrong. I think America has tried to so-called strike a balance between advancing human rights and U.S.-China cooperations in strategic area. And of course, when they say strike balance, that means they're going to compromise on human rights. So human rights never become a dominant issues on these meetings with Chinese. But I hope this time it will be a dominant issue because they can avoid not to talking about it.
Ambassador Soderbergh, I mean, should we expect anything else? I mean, clearly the US has a lot of strategic issues that are outstanding with China and globally, which it wants Chinese help on. Should we really expect that they will be pushing this line that we're a beacon of freedom against Chinese tyranny right now? I mean, shouldn't we just expect the US to be looking at this as an area, as a distraction, frankly, from the real business?
Not
of
at
Beijing
all.
right now?
Very much part of our dialogue with the Chinese is the need for them to move on human rights. We regularly condemn their oppression. We regularly condemn their lack of freedom, their censorship, their political prisoner.
But
no U.S. Not at all euphorically. Rhetorically. No, it's very much part of the dialogue. That's not the only thing we talk to the Chinese about. To your question of whether or not we would have wanted this to happen right now, that's not our choice. And to the Chinese statement, I fully reject that. This man came to our embassy. It's not like we went out and captured him. When an individual comes to our embassy, we usually open the door.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point. Lianchao Han, I mean, how much contact does the U.S. have with dissidents in China? Did they have any role? I mean, how did he end up in the U.S. embassy in the first place? I mean, it's all quite murky. I know your group certainly was quite involved in all of this. What sort of connection does this administration have with dissidents in China? How actively are they supporting them?
I think they do have some connections with the dissident community. I think the Assistant Secretary Posner was very involved in this case, and without American diplomats' help, I think.
Yeah, but even before Chen came to the U.S. embassy, what about that? What about his break for the embassy? Was there U.S. involvement in that?
No, that is absolutely mostly individual activists that work together and helped him escape.
Which is why we don't, the ones who need to apologize here are the Chinese, and it's to Chen and his family.
Yep.
What I think you'll see happening over the next few days is a little bit more clarity about what is happening to them. You'll see that the U.S. is going to stand with him to make sure that he and his family are safe. It's his decision whether he wants to stay in China or leave, not the United States, but I have no doubt that the United States will strongly be pushing. They weren't expecting human rights to be on the agenda this time, but it is now.
Well,
I don't think it frankly plays into the campaign. This is an issue of human rights and the need for the United States to stand next to Chen, and they will.
Inevitably, Bill Blum, then that leads to the U.S.'s position as beacon of human rights, as a nation that does tell China to get its house in order. Do you detect any irony in that at all, though, perhaps?
Hypocrisy would be the word. I mean, I have documented in my books the very extensive violation of human rights in U.S. foreign policy for the past 60 years. I mean, we have a horrible record on human rights. Take torture, which is certainly a prime example of a human rights violation. Has any nation in the world tortured more people than America in the past 60 years? I mean, it's very extensive. When you sit down
yes, of course they have a lot more. I'll take a disagreement with that. There are plenty of people who have tortured more than the United States, and I think President Obama has made it very clear. There have certainly been mistakes made by the United States government, but I think it's important to look at what this president is doing.
At the very least, there's a recognition of how the U.S. is seen around the world when it does lecture other nations on human rights.
I think President Obama has fundamentally changed that. He came to office saying we're going to. Yes, if you look at the polls, yes.
He has invaded 6 countries.
The polls of the United States are now vastly different than they were over the last 10 years, and you can go into. Well, just look at the polls. It's true, and I think President Obama has made it.
I mean, there's been a decline in his approval ratings around the world, hasn't there, over the course of his term? I mean, certainly they were very high once, but as his foreign policy.
I'm not talking about. I'm comparing it to the previous administration, where there was clear torture and clear problems that drove America's approval rating down, vastly down, and that's pretty much come back now. And I think this president has made it very clear that we stand for this. And look at it, where he went speaks for itself. He chose to go to the United States Embassy for help, and he received help.
But right now, all of his friends are decrying what happened.
And I would caution you to say we've thrown him under the bus or to the piranhas. We don't know. Wait till this folds out. I have no doubt that the United States will stand toe-to-toe with him in trying to secure his safety and for that of his family. That is clear. I have no doubt that a week from now, you'll see a very different story coming
And
out.
if there isn't a different story, what should we make of it?
I'd be out there pushing them to do it. I think he's come to our embassy, and now we have a responsibility to make sure he is safe, and I'm sure I actually think we'll do that. So give them a little time to let the dust clear and see what's happening. We don't know what's going on right now.
Bill Blum, though, I mean, clearly you're a critic of US foreign policy. Nonetheless, there is a problem in China when it comes to prisoners of conscience and so forth. I mean, clearly we can make the same case for Bradley Manning and so forth and various people in Bagram or wherever for the US, but certainly there is a problem in China. I mean, these are the sort of figures that we have. The non-profit Duihua group tracks jailed citizens in China. Its most recent report says that 5,000 political and religious prisoners were being held at the end of 2011. The group also says there are more people in China detained for endangering state security than at any time since '97. Charges of endangering state security are frequently used to curb speech and association. Bill Blum, it's true the US has a murky role on human rights, in your view, and so forth, but nonetheless, if the US does take a position against poor policy in another country, should therefore critics of the US immediately say, well, it's just not credible, or should they at least, I mean, at least that's something there, isn't it? Can't some good come of that, do you think?
Well, I don't blame them for being tough on China. China does have a bad record on human rights, but they should at least show some humility. And it's well known with people who follow the news carefully that the U.S. is a gross violator of human rights all over the world. The renditions for years and years, and we're still doing renditions as far as we know, they kidnap people right off the sidewalk, throw them in the car, and fly them to a place to be tortured. That's been going on for decades. I mean, what kind of force for human rights is that? That's our record. That's one example of many I could give.
Lianchao Han, then, I mean, is that how dissidents view the US then, as a beacon of democracy? Is that why Chen went to the US embassy? I mean, of course, in the past, that sort of attitude has been used against dissidents because then they're seen as US puppets with close links to organizations like the National Endowment of Democracy and so forth, which are sometimes looked at with great suspicion and so forth. I mean, what is this relationship? Is there just this very this clear view of the US as the guarantor of freedom for dissidents in China?
Absolutely. I think people in China, particularly the dissident community, look up to the United States as a beacon, and American historically has been helping China. And I can tell you that in the 80s, President Reagan persistent pressure on Taiwan made Taiwan become now a most dynamic democracy.
But isn't that precisely why the Chinese have problems with what they call U.S. interference in its internal affairs? Because I mean, what they say that a lot of this assistance is rather underhand, frankly, and that certainly the U.S. wouldn't stand for Bradley Manning going to the Chinese embassy, for example, and asking for,
that's exactly wrong. We would welcome that. People do it all the time. People are free here to criticize us, talk about us, blog about us. That's what America's all about. The fact that you're here and demonstrates that.
Manning can't go to the embassy. He's a prisoner, and he was tortured. Solitary confinement is torture, and he's had that for many months and years. So, you know, the average American is not aware of the U.S. government's record on human rights, so I wouldn't expect the average Chinese person to be aware of it. It's not surprising that Chen, like other Chinese people, would still think of the U.S. as the beacon of freedom and choose their embassy as a safeguard. But that's based purely on not knowing what's happening.
I don't think that's true. I mean, we certainly have made our mistakes in the past, but by and large, we are seen as the beacon of freedom. And
yeah, I'm saying we are seen that, but we're not.
This president, yes, we are.
I wasn't questioning that we're seen that way.
I think you have to put things in perspective, and I think here, what you're going to see in this case, we're talking about the Chinese are the ones who are abusing human rights.
But Lianchao Han, I mean, can you not? I mean, do you really believe that? I mean, can't you see that the U.S. has other strategic interests, and frankly, one shouldn't expect the U.S. to put all of those on hold purely for the sake of one person, for example? I mean, is that even rational, do you think?
I think so. I think use Chen Guangcheng as a case that can turn this crisis into an opportunity to change China, make China become a democracy. That will be a major contribution to international peace and security.
All right, well, we'll see in the coming days. Lianchao Han, thank you very much Bill Blum, thank you as well. Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, thank you very much.
My pleasure. And
that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.